Elections to elect a new government usually pose two questions to the voter. Should the status quo be maintained, or is it time for a change? And political candidates who are close to the voter can sometimes land a surprise victory against the candidate most favored to win. Popular leaders often see themselves voted out of power because they failed to connect with the common citizen and understand the expectations. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we take a look at some of the biggest election surprises in history. Between 1940 and 1945, Winston Churchill was probably the most popular British Prime Minister of all time. In May of 1945, his approval rating in the opinion polls, which had never fallen below 78%, stood at 83%. Barring a few exceptions, the general feeling among politicians and commentators was that Winston Churchill would easily lead the Conservatives to victory at the upcoming general election. But it was the opposite that happened. In the election, the Conservatives faced their greatest defeat, and Winston Churchill was held partly responsible for the defeat. Whoa, wait. The guy who led the country through World War II was held responsible for the defeat of his party in the next general election? Yes, indeed. Despite succeeding in office during wartime, the voters felt that he was not fit to lead during peacetime. And Churchill indeed was a brilliant leader during the war. After taking over as Prime Minister in 1940, he invited the leaders of the Labour, Liberal and Conservative parties, that is Attlee, Sinclair and Chamberlain, to serve in a coalition government. With this, he brought all the warring factions together to mobilize the country behind the war effort, and the results were obvious. But as the war drew to a close, the party politics resumed, but Churchill found himself without any purpose or direction. And at the same time, Labour Party and its allies in the media ran an effective propaganda war on the home front. They vilified members of the pre-war Conservative Party as having been appeasers of Hitler and having failed to rearm Britain. And they painted the 1930s as an era of poverty and mass unemployment. And to counter this status, the Labour Party held out the prospect of a new social order that would ensure better housing, free medical services, and employment for all. On the other hand, the Conservative campaign was built around the personality of Winston Churchill. So it fell squarely on Churchill to prove that he was not only a wartime leader, but also a constructive peacetime statesman. So how did Churchill do as a campaigner? Very poorly. In his first campaign broadcast on June the 4th, 1945, he accused Attlee of harboring socialist dictatorial ambitions and even compared him to the Nazis. Churchill went on to declare that Labour would have to fall back to some sort of Gestapo to push through its reforms. Gestapo, of course, was the infamous Nazi police force. His opponent, Clement Attlee, immediately jumped upon the opportunity and pointed out that the speech of Churchill clearly showed that he was ill-suited to be a leader in peaceful times. However, due credit has to be given to Churchill for inviting Clement Attlee to accompany him to the Potsdam Conference, which was happening at the same time as the British election campaign. And he did this to ensure continuity in the event of a change of government halfway through the conference. The Potsdam Conference was held at Potsdam, a suburb of Berlin, which was participated by the US, UK, and the Soviet Union to discuss post-World War II Europe. Both Churchill and Attlee returned on the 25th of July and awaited the election results as they started to come in the following morning. By the afternoon, it was apparent that Labour had won by a landslide with 393 seats and an overall majority of 183 in the House of Commons. While we debate Churchill's fitness as a peacetime prime minister, there's another element that we must consider which could have swayed the vote in Attlee's favour. Churchill had become the face of the war. And probably after 6 years of a deadly conflict, the people of the United Kingdom wanted to see a face of peace. On the night of November 2nd, 1948, as the first edition deadline approached, Chicago Tribune managing editor Pat Maloney had to make the headline call. The East Coast tallies for the presidential election were still not in, but Maloney chose to bank on his pollsters and picked the headline, "Dewey defeats Truman." And by the time this edition of the Chicago Tribune ended up in the hands of its subscribers, US President Harry Truman had pulled off the greatest upset in presidential election history by defeating his Republican challenger, New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey. Now, going into the 1948 election, Harry Truman faced a different problem than Winston Churchill. To the American voter, he was the little-known vice president in the shadows of FDR, who got thrown into the limelight after FDR suddenly passed away in April of 1945, just after the start of his fourth presidential term. In the eyes of the voter, he really did not measure up to the aura, presence, and the leadership qualities of FDR. Moreover, the Democrats had been in the White House for almost 16 years, so a change was inevitable. And to make matters worse, there were factions within the Democratic Party itself who were opposing Harry Truman. On July 26, 1948, Harry Truman had signed an executive order creating the President's Committee on Equality of Treatment and Opportunity in the Armed Services. That meant desegregation of the US military, meaning that there would be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. And this did not sit well with the Southern Democrats. When Truman captured the presidential nomination at the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia, the Southern delegates triggered a walkout and launched a third party, Dixiecrat, led by Governor Strom Thurmond of South Carolina. The Dixiecrats did not think that they would win the presidential election itself, but they were hopeful that they would win enough electoral votes to throw the election into the House, where they could extract concessions from either Dewey or Truman in exchange for their support. In FDR's third term, his vice president was Henry A. Wallace, and he was the second faction within the Democrats who launched the Progressive Party to contest Truman's presidency. His main gripe was that Truman was too confrontational with the Soviet Union. Technically, this actually played in favor of Truman because if his own party felt that he was too confrontational with the Soviet Union, the Republicans could not accuse him of being too weak towards the Soviets. So, bolstered by this three-way split within the Democrats, Dewey was very confident of winning. So confident that he ran a very vapid, risk-free campaign, almost to the point that he started taking his victory for granted. Truman became defiant in the last weeks before the election and embarked on a whistle-stop campaign across the United States. He traveled to America's cities and towns and launched a relentless wave of blistering partisan attacks against a do-nothing Congress, which was GOP controlled at the time. His primary target were the undecided voters, and he was portraying himself as an outsider contending with this do-nothing Congress. And incidentally, the pollsters also stopped polling before the effect of Truman's whistle-stop campaigning could display the results. On election night, Harry Truman romped home with 303 electoral votes compared to 189 for Dewey. The Dixiecrats, led by Storm Thurmond, garnered 39 electoral votes from the South, but these were not enough to influence Truman in any way because he romped home with a straight majority. The progressive Henry A. Wallace did not win any electoral votes, and with respect to the popular vote, Truman romped home with about 49.5% of the popular vote compared to 45% for Dewey. Authoritarian rule usually ends in bloodshed, either upon the death of the existing ruler or midway through a coup. But on October 14, 1964, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's 11-year period of dominance within the Soviet Union came to an abrupt but very peaceful end, surprising the rest of the world. Khrushchev was stripped of his party and state posts and sent into an obscure retirement. Virtually overnight, from premier, he became something of an unperson in the Soviet Union. His name disappeared from the media and was scarcely mentioned after. And this quiet removal of Khrushchev from office is often referred to as the October Plenum. So what led to Khrushchev's ouster? Most of the grievances highlighted by the party members who engineered his ouster seem to have been around his leadership style. But it is important to note that Khrushchev himself took office with an objective of cleaning up the brutal policies of his predecessor, Joseph Stalin. So Khrushchev wanted to have a more open political structure within the Soviet Union, where dissent was okay and the use of terror in Soviet politics had to be stopped. But with this change, Khrushchev essentially laid the groundwork for elite members to scheme and plot against one another and their superiors. And because there was no penalty, the stakes also started getting higher. Though ultimately Leonid Brezhnev became the ringleader of the plot to oust Khrushchev, in the beginning there were other members of the Central Committee like Alexander Shelepin and Dmitry Polyansky who were supposed to have initiated the plot. Shelepin was a hardliner, so it is often interpreted that he may have had a gripe against the sudden reforms that Khrushchev was trying to implement. But once folks like Brezhnev came into the mix, it was clear that the plot had become a lot wider. And the strategy for Khrushchev's ouster centered around enlisting support from within the Central Committee itself. And the execution plan entailed appointing key representatives to start the process of canvassing the various committee members. For example, Igoryachev, the Moscow First Secretary, was to focus on all the folks in Moscow. And likewise, to get Ukraine's support, there was another representative. So the October plenum, where Khrushchev was ousted, was not arranged till there was a clear majority in both the Presidium and the Central Committee in favor of Khrushchev's replacement. The entire execution was fairly well planned, and the planning work had started around about March of 1964. Wait, so between March and October of 1964, Khrushchev had no clue that the Central Committee was planning his ouster? Well, that is true, and there are two factors in play here. One was Khrushchev's leadership style that had alienated a lot of the party members. So he had very few loyalists left to break the news to him. And second, his frequent trips out of the country did not help. Khrushchev was away from Moscow for a total of 135 days during the first 9 months of 1964 alone. And as the day for the execution of the plot drew closer, the KGB too was roped in, and they held off all information from getting to Khrushchev. So when the stage was set for his ouster, his Presidium colleagues telephoned him in Pitswenda, which is a resort town in the country of Georgia, where Khrushchev was at the time, and they asked him to be back in Moscow for an urgent meeting to discuss the agricultural measures to be presented at the coming Central Committee plenum in November. The call was supposedly made on the evening of October the 12th by Brezhnev. Khrushchev initially refused to come because he was still on vacation and he didn't think the matter was that urgent. But when Brezhnev insisted that his presence was required, he agreed. After Brezhnev hung up with Khrushchev, there was major nervous tension in Moscow. The question was, had Khrushchev taken the bait, or had he smelt a rat? And all the plotters were worried that if Khrushchev had smelt a rat, he would be up to something, and all of them were going to be in trouble. It was only after they learnt that Khrushchev had ordered a plane to fly him back to Moscow did they breathe a sigh of relief. Khrushchev knew something was amiss, but his fears were confirmed once he noticed when he landed in Moscow that his security detail had been altered. But nevertheless, he reported to the Kremlin as he had been requested to. All was quiet in Moscow on 13th of October 1964 as Khrushchev made his way to Kremlin. The leader of the hardline faction, Alexander Shelepin, put forth the agenda for the removal of Khrushchev and was also one of the outspoken representatives of the prosecution. Interestingly, on day one, Brezhnev was very quiet. The issues raised mostly centered around Khrushchev's leadership style and to some extent policy questions. On matters of policy, Khrushchev actually pushed back, saying most of his policy decisions were the outcome of a collective decisioning process and he could not be squarely blamed for those. Two of these policy decisions, which were actually collective, revolved around the food shortages and reduction of the work week to a 5-day week. And his prosecutors alleged that because of the delay in resolving these two issues, his popularity among the general Soviet populace had dropped. So the logic put forth was that if he continued in power, it might give rise to social unrest. Now, between day one and day two, there was a general agreement among the prosecutors not to answer their phones because they were worried that Khrushchev may start calling each one of them individually and convincing them to change their stance. Towards the end of day two, Khrushchev got up to speak and he acknowledged mistakes on his part, even apologizing for his behavior towards some of the leaders. However, he did point out that it was his openness towards dissent that had given the power to all the prosecutors to criticize him. But he ended with thanking them for letting him retire. And this meant that he had feared that he could have been removed by violent means, and the fact that he was being let go gracefully was a surprise and a very big deal in the Soviet Union at that time. The rest of the world was shocked at this development, but more shocked that it had happened very peacefully in the Soviet Union. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Why is Sir William Osler considered the father of modern medicine? He who studies medicine without books sails an uncharted sea, but he who studies medicine without patience does not go to sea at all. This is a quote from Sir William Osler, and he's known as the father of modern medicine for revolutionizing the way in which medical education was taught. During his tenure at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, William Osler played a central role in establishing the internship and residency system, and he also instituted the method of training students at the bedside of the patient. So the answer is C, innovative medical teaching curriculum. Question for the current episode. What was a major impact of Harry Truman's shock defeat of Thomas Dewey across the political system? Was it A, Democrats vowed not to split the party in the future? B, newspapers suspended publishing late-night editions on election night? C, Republicans decided to not end their campaign till the day of the election? Or D, pollsters started polling through the day of the election? Once again, what was one major impact of Harry Truman's shock defeat of Thomas Dewey on the political system? A, Democrats vowed not to split the party in the future. B, newspapers suspended publishing late-night editions on election night. C, Republicans decided to not end their campaign till the day of the election. D, pollsters started polling through the day of the election. The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. In the next episode, we look at some prominent pioneers of the 20th century. Pioneers who made us dream by overcoming obstacles and crossing new frontiers. New frontiers like scaling Mount Everest or making it all the way to the South Pole. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.